At 60, Evelyn Mercer had almost nothing left that felt secure. Her marriage was long over. Her daughter had built a life hours away. The rent on her tiny bookbinding shop was rising faster than she could afford, and the business she had spent years protecting was close to disappearing. Then, on the morning of her 60th birthday, a letter arrived from the Mercer family attorney with news she had waited 18 years to hear. The family trust her father created before his death could finally be opened. There was only one problem. For reasons no one had ever explained to Evelyn, the trust had been legally sealed until the exact day she turned 60. Her older brother Richard had inherited the visible pieces of their family legacy years ago, and when Evelyn returned to Ashford to learn what had been kept from her, even he seemed almost embarrassed by what she received. There was no hidden fortune waiting in a bank account, no valuable stock portfolio, no grand house with her name on the deed. The trust's principal asset was an old, locked archive room on the unused second floor of the Mercer family's former printing building. After 18 years of waiting, Evelyn had apparently inherited a room full of old paper. Richard told her not to expect too much. To him, it was another strange decision made by a father who had become increasingly stubborn near the end of his life. Evelyn almost believed him. She almost signed the paperwork, took the key, and accepted that even at 60 she had once again received the part of the family nobody else wanted. But when the attorney placed the old brass key in her hand, Evelyn noticed something that made her stop. The small tag attached to it wasn't written in her father's handwriting. It belonged to her mother, Margaret, who had died before the trust was created. 3 words were written beneath Evelyn's name. At 60. Only. Evelyn opened the archive room that afternoon. Inside were rows of carefully preserved boxes stretching back nearly a century, all organized too precisely to have been forgotten. Then she found the handwritten catalog. 3 women's names appeared again and again: Anna Mercer, Ruth Mercer, Margaret Mercer. 3 generations of women whose lives Evelyn had been told almost nothing about. But it was the final entry that made her hands begin to shake. Someone who had died years earlier had written Evelyn's name into the archive and left instructions telling her exactly which box to open first. And when Evelyn finally lifted the lid of box 17 and saw what her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother had preserved for her, she realized the trust had never really been about money at all. What those letters revealed about 3 generations of her family and why Evelyn had been forced to wait until 60 to read them was something no one had ever told her. But before we open that first letter with Evelyn, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Wherever you are, I hope you're having a peaceful morning, afternoon, or evening, and I wish you a truly wonderful day ahead. And if you enjoy emotional family stories about hidden inheritances, forgotten histories, and secrets that change everything we thought we knew, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's return to Evelyn. Because inside box 17 was a letter written decades before she was born, and the first sentence explained why one woman in the Mercer family had decided their true story could never be allowed to disappear. Evelyn Mercer turned 60 on a Tuesday morning while standing behind the counter of her bookbinding shop, staring at an envelope from her landlord she had already opened twice. The new rent would begin in 6 weeks. She ran her thumb along the paper's edge, calculating again, although the numbers had not improved since yesterday. 2 restoration commissions were overdue for payment. 3 customers had postponed work. The savings account she once considered an emergency cushion had become the money she used for ordinary months. At 8:10, her phone rang. "Happy birthday," Claire said. Evelyn smiled despite herself. "You remembered." "Mom?" I'm 34, not 14. You forgot when you were 14. I was terrible at 14. Claire paused. What are you doing tonight? Working on your 60th birthday? Books don't respect milestones. Neither do you, apparently. Evelyn looked around the narrow shop. Rolls of book cloth filled one shelf, leather scraps another. The familiar smell of paste and old paper usually comforted her. That morning it felt temporary. I might get dinner somewhere. With someone, possibly. That means no. Evelyn laughed softly. Claire knew her too well. How's the shop? Fine, Mom. Busy enough. Claire was quiet. You do that thing where your voice gets brighter when something is wrong. Evelyn folded the rent notice and slipped it beneath a ledger. Nothing's wrong that I can't handle. It was a sentence she had used for most of Claire's life. After they hung up, Evelyn noticed the second envelope in the morning mail, heavy cream paper, her full name typed across the front. The return address was in Ashford. She stopped breathing for a moment. Mercer Family Council. Evelyn opened it with the small bone folder she used for creasing paper. The letter contained 4 paragraphs. She read the first twice. Under the terms established by the late Thomas Mercer. The Mercer Family Trust had reached its designated distribution date upon Evelyn Mercer attaining 60 years of age. She sat down. Her father had been dead 18 years. For nearly all that time, Evelyn had known a trust existed in her name, and almost nothing else. Thomas had refused to discuss its contents before his death. The attorneys afterward had explained only that its principal provisions could not be accessed until her 60th birthday. Richard had called it Dad's last exercise in control. Evelyn had eventually stopped asking. Richard received the visible family legacy responsibilities, property interests. The remaining Mercer business affairs in Ashford. Evelyn received something locked behind time. Now the lock had expired. The letter requested her presence in Ashford that afternoon. Evelyn closed the shop early. The drive west took long enough for anticipation to turn into embarrassment. She was 60 years old, divorced, worried about rent, and driving toward her childhood town, wondering whether her dead father had finally left her enough money to make life easier. She hated how badly she wanted that possibility. Ashford appeared beneath a gray autumn sky, its brick storefronts smaller than she remembered. Richard was waiting outside the attorney's office. At 64, her brother had become leaner, his hair mostly silver. "Happy birthday," he said. "Thank you." Their hug was brief but genuine. "Any idea what this is about?" she asked. "The trust." "No more than you. You never asked Dad repeatedly." Richard opened the door for her. "Knowing him, it's probably shares in something that went bankrupt in 1997. Evelyn smiled. That would be appropriate. Or boxes of old Mercer junk he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Even better. The attorney, Caroline Webb, met them in a conference room with a thick folder and a small wooden box. After verifying Evelyn's identification, she explained that the trust contained a modest maintenance account. Evelyn's heart lifted briefly until Caroline clarified that the money was restricted primarily to expenses associated with the trust property. "What property?" Evelyn asked. Caroline turned to the governing document. The principal trust asset is described as the Mercer Family Archive and the room in which it has been preserved, together with the beneficiary rights established herein. Evelyn waited for the rest. Caroline closed her mouth. "That's it. That is the principal asset. An archive, yes." Richard shifted beside her. "Where is the Mercer Print Building?" Richard frowned. "There's an archive room upstairs. According to the trust documents." Evelyn stared at Caroline. "I waited 18 years for a room." "Legally?" You waited until the specified age for the trust restrictions to terminate? That isn't really an improvement. Caroline remained professional, but her expression softened. I understand this may not be what you expected. Evelyn looked down at the papers. She had not admitted to expecting money. Apparently, she had not needed to. What's in the archive? The trust does not provide a detailed inventory. Does Richard have rights to it? Not under this provision. Evelyn is the designated beneficiary. Richard leaned back. Dad never mentioned this to me. Evelyn heard something in his voice, not jealousy, exactly, but surprise. For once, there had been a Mercer family matter Richard had not been entrusted to manage. Caroline explained that the room had remained secured and that basic building access had been maintained through arrangements established by Thomas. The trust's restrictions had prevented distribution of its contents before Evelyn reached 60. Richard shook his head. He could have just given her the papers 18 years ago. Apparently, he chose not to. Evelyn felt the old irritation returning. Thomas had always preferred decisions to explanations, even dead. He had managed to make her wait until an arbitrary birthday before discovering that her inheritance consisted of paper stored above an obsolete printing floor. "Can I sell it?" she asked. Caroline glanced at the document. Your options become broader now that the age condition has been satisfied, but I recommend you inspect the asset before making decisions. Richard looked at Evelyn. She restores old books. Maybe Dad thought this was poetic. Dad wasn't poetic. True. Caroline reached for the wooden box. There is one more item. She opened it and removed an old brass key attached to a rectangular paper tag by faded string. This was deposited with the trust instructions and is to be released directly to you today. Evelyn accepted it. The brass was cold and darker around the teeth from age. One side of the tag carried a number corresponding to the archive room. She turned it over. Her body went still. What Richard asked, Evelyn did not answer. She knew that handwriting. Smaller than her father's, slightly slanted, with a distinctive curl in the capital E. She had seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, school permission slips, and notes tucked into lunches when she was a child. That's Mom's handwriting, she said. Richard leaned closer. Their mother, Margaret Mercer, had died before the trust had become the strange 18-year barrier Evelyn had resented. Yet Margaret had handled this key. More than that, she had labeled it specifically for Evelyn. Caroline looked from one sibling to the other. Your father deposited the key with the trust documents. I can't tell you when the tag was written. Evelyn barely heard her. She read the words again. Suddenly, the locked archive no longer felt like one of Thomas Mercer's eccentric decisions. Her mother had known about it. Her mother had expected Evelyn to reach this exact day. Written beneath her name were 3 words. For Evelyn at 60. Evelyn kept the brass key in her hand as Richard drove them across Ashford. The Mercer Print Building stood 3 blocks from the town square. A narrow 3-story brick structure with faded lettering still visible above the first-floor windows. Mercer Printing and Press. Evelyn had not entered it in years. As children, she and Richard had been allowed downstairs only when an adult was present. Their grandfather had treated the printing floor like a dangerous machine even after most of the equipment stopped running. Richard unlocked the front entrance. I use the first floor for storage now, he said. A tenant had the back office until last year. And you never went upstairs? Sometimes. There's nothing much there. He looked at the key in her hand. Apparently I was wrong. Dust covered the old wooden stairs. On the second floor, several rooms stood open, filled with shelving, broken office chairs, boxes of business records, and obsolete printing equipment. Richard switched on a row of ceiling lights. Only half responded. Where exactly is this room? Evelyn checked the number on the key tag. They moved past 2 storage rooms before reaching a corridor partially blocked by empty metal shelves. Richard helped drag one aside. Behind it, at the end of the passage, stood a heavy wooden door Evelyn vaguely remembered that she asked. Richard stared at it. I thought that was an old records closet. Did you ever try opening it? Once. Maybe 20 years ago. It was locked. He stepped closer. Mom used to come up here. Evelyn looked at him. You remember that? Not often. I remember waiting downstairs for her a few times. Why, I never asked. Richard touched the doorframe. She didn't let us follow her. Evelyn felt Margaret's handwriting on the key tag become heavier in her pocket. She inserted the brass key. For a moment it resisted. Then the lock turned with a deep mechanical click. Richard moved behind her as Evelyn pushed the door inward. The room smelled of old paper, cedar, and dry dust, but not abandonment. Tall wooden cabinets lined 2 walls. Archival boxes filled shelves from waist height almost to the ceiling. A narrow reading table stood beneath the single window, covered by a cloth. Heavy curtains had been drawn to protect the room from sunlight. Evelyn stepped inside and stopped. This isn't junk. Richard said nothing. She knew neglected paper. She had spent most of her working life repairing what happened when people stored books in damp basements or sunny attics. These materials had been protected deliberately. Boxes were raised from the floor. Several cabinets contained wrapped volumes. Labels had been written in different hands, some faded brown with age, others comparatively recent. Evelyn pulled on the cotton gloves she kept in her work bag and examined the nearest box without opening it. Somebody maintained this. Dad? Maybe. She looked around. But the system is older than Dad. Dates on the labels stretched backward through decades. 1986, 1962, 1941, 1919. Richard walked slowly along the shelves. How much is here? I have no idea. Can you tell if it's valuable? Evelyn gave him a look. You've been in the room for 3 minutes. I mean financially. I know what you mean. She touched the edge of a brittle label. And I'm not touching more until somebody looks at the storage conditions. Richard sighed. So we need an expert for the room full of paper. You make it sound ridiculous. Yesterday I didn't know the room existed. Evelyn took out her phone and called Nathan Cole. She knew him by reputation from regional conservation work and had met him twice at library events. Nathan was 62, partly retired, and lived less than half an hour from Ashford. When Evelyn explained what she had found, he agreed to stop by before evening. He arrived carrying a small environmental meter and a battered leather case. Nathan greeted Evelyn warmly, nodded to Richard, and spent the first 15 minutes looking without opening anything. Who arranged this? He asked. That's what we're trying to figure out. Evelyn said. Nathan checked the window covering. Shelves and air near the exterior wall. It wasn't one person. Richard frowned. How can you tell? Nathan pointed to the boxes. Different materials, different labeling conventions. Some preservation work is much newer than the documents themselves. Someone kept adapting the archive. He selected one box after Evelyn showed him the trust paperwork. Inside were folders separated by acid-free sheets that had clearly been added long after the original letters were written. This collection was cared for across multiple periods. Evelyn felt a quiet unease. By my mother, possibly. Maybe others before her. Nathan closed the box. Don't assume age means damage. Whoever handled this understood enough to keep most of it stable. Richard leaned against the table. So Dad spent money maintaining letters while the building itself deteriorated? Richard. I'm stating a fact. Evelyn understood his irritation. He had inherited responsibilities she had not carried. And now another hidden obligation had appeared inside a building he thought he understood. Still, she could not look at the room as a burden anymore. Someone had wanted these papers to survive. While Nathan examined a cabinet, Evelyn removed the cloth from the reading table. Beneath it lay a large, handwritten catalog bound with dark green cloth. The first pages listed box numbers, dates, and names. Evelyn turned them carefully. One name appeared repeatedly in the oldest entries: Anna Mercer. "Do you know her?" Nathan asked. "My great-grandmother," Evelyn said. "I think." The uncertainty embarrassed her. She knew almost nothing about Anna beyond a photograph once displayed in her parents' hallway. Later pages introduced another name: Ruth Mercer. Evelyn recognized that one immediately. "My grandmother." Richard came beside her. "Dad's mother." "No." Mom's family line carried the Mercer name too after the branches joined. She continued. Then Margaret Mercer appeared across dozens of entries. Their mother. Evelyn stopped turning pages. Anna, Ruth, Margaret, 3 women, preserved in sequence across nearly a century. "This isn't a business archive," she said. Nathan looked over her shoulder. "Not primarily." Richard's expression had lost its skepticism. Mom knew all of this was here. She had to. Evelyn moved toward the final pages. The handwriting changed several times throughout the catalog, suggesting one person had begun it and others continued. Near the end, however, the entries became sparse. Several blank lines followed the last dated item. Evelyn nearly closed the book. Then she noticed writing at the bottom of the page. Unlike the formal catalog entries, it was a direct instruction. Her name appeared first. "Evelyn?" Richard leaned closer. "Is that Mom's writing?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. The letters were older and shakier than the words on the key tag, but she recognized the same slant. Her pulse quickened. Nathan stepped back, giving them room. Evelyn read the line once silently. Her mother had not merely known about the archive. Margaret had known Evelyn would someday enter it. She had known there would be hundreds of boxes and that her daughter would need somewhere to begin. Evelyn placed one finger beside the final entry without touching the ink. The instruction contained only 6 words. Evelyn begins at box 17. Evelyn found box 17 on the 3rd shelf of the cabinet nearest the window. It was smaller than she expected. A gray archival box with a number written neatly on its spine and a second label beneath it: Anna Mercer Correspondence. Richard stood behind her while Nathan adjusted the lamp on the reading table. "Before you open it," Nathan said, "clean hands are better than gloves for most paper. Support anything fragile. Don't flatten folds that resist." Evelyn removed the cotton gloves she had worn the day before and washed her hands in the downstairs sink. When she returned, Richard was staring at the box. "Do you actually remember Anna?" he asked. "A photograph, same." Evelyn lifted the lid. Inside were several folders arranged by year. The earliest letters dated from the first decade of the 20th century. Some were written in Anna's hand. Others had been sent to her by relatives, suppliers, customers, and people Evelyn did not recognize. "So what are we looking for?" Richard asked. "I don't know. Mom told you to start here. She didn't tell me what to find." Evelyn opened the first folder. At first, the contents seemed ordinary. Orders for paper, notes about printing schedules, household correspondence mixed with business instructions. Then Evelyn noticed how often Anna's handwriting appeared on documents connected to Mercer Printing and Press. She had corrected proofs in pencil. She had calculated invoices. She had written instructions concerning payroll and paper purchases. One letter from a supplier addressed her directly regarding an overdue shipment because, according to the writer, Mr. Mercer advised that you keep the accounts more accurately than any of us. Evelyn smiled despite herself. Apparently, Anna wasn't sitting at home waiting for dinner. Richard pulled up a chair. Evelyn continued. Another letter thanked Anna for correcting an article before publication. A third asked whether she could provide another unsigned piece for the Saturday edition. Evelyn paused. She wrote for the paper, maybe occasionally. Nobody ever said she wrote anything. Richard shrugged. Nobody said she didn't. The answer irritated her. That's convenient, Evelyn. We're reading private letters from 100 years ago. Maybe nobody remembered. That's exactly the problem, Nathan. Working at another table, glanced over but did not interfere. Evelyn found several clipped newspaper columns stored behind the letters. No author appeared beneath the headlines. Anna had marked corrections in the margins, and one draft in her handwriting matched a published article almost word for word. The family history Evelyn remembered from childhood credited Anna's husband with expanding the printing business and establishing its local paper. Anna appeared mostly in photographs beside him, yet here she was inside the machinery of the enterprise, balancing accounts, editing copy, negotiating supplies, writing articles. Richard examined one invoice. She may have helped more than we knew. Helped? Evelyn looked at him. If a man kept the accounts and edited the newspaper, would you call that helping? I'm not trying to diminish her. It sounds like you are. Richard pushed the invoice back. And it sounds like you've already decided what these papers mean. The old rhythm between them surfaced quickly. Richard defending the established version because it was established, Evelyn hearing dismissal even before she knew whether it was intended. She lowered her voice. I'm trying to understand why Mom sent me to this box. Then understand it. Don't turn every letter into evidence against the family. Evelyn stared at him. Evidence against whom? Richard had no answer. He stood and walked toward the shelves. Nathan waited until the silence settled. Archives rarely give you the whole person, he said, but sometimes they show you the part that was left out. Evelyn returned to the letters. Near the middle of the box, she found a small notebook containing Anna's inventory of documents she intended to preserve. Like the business records, the list included personal correspondence between women in the family. Besides several entries, Anna had written reasons for keeping them. One note caught Evelyn's attention. Keep the account in her own words, Nathan. He came over. Evelyn showed him the notebook. Could this be the beginning of the archive? Nathan examined the dates and compared them with the catalog. Possibly. The organization is primitive compared with what you have now. But look at these numbers. Anna had assigned simple sequential marks to letters and papers. The earliest labels in the archive followed the same pattern. Someone later expanded her system. Nathan said, then someone expanded that one. The modern archival boxes were added much later. So Anna started saving these deliberately. That's what it looks like. Richard returned to the table. Families save letters, not like this. Evelyn said, she was cataloging them. She turned another page. Near the bottom, Anna had written a sentence in darker ink. What is not preserved will eventually be remembered incorrectly. Evelyn read it aloud. Richard's expression changed slightly. For the first time, he did not offer an objection. They spent the next hour moving carefully through the remaining folders. The archive began to feel less like a collection and more like an argument Anna had been making against disappearance. She saved letters describing women's work, decisions, disappointments, and contributions that never appeared in formal family histories. She preserved drafts beside published pieces without names. She kept financial notes proving who had actually managed certain parts of the printing business. Yet Evelyn still did not understand why Margaret had directed her here.
Nathan noticed something else while comparing Box 17 with nearby containers.
"These labels aren't all contemporary." "Meaning?" Evelyn asked. He pointed to the numbering. "Anna's original marks appear inside the folders. The outer box numbers were imposed later. Some boxes were clearly added decades after her death and integrated into the same sequence." "By Ruth, maybe?" "Then perhaps Margaret. We'd need to compare handwriting and dates." Evelyn looked around the room. Anna had begun something. Someone after her had decided not merely to keep it, but to continue it. Richard sat down again. So Mom inherited a family filing habit. Maybe more than that. Evelyn returned to the final folder in Box 17. It contained personal letters rather than business papers. Several were addressed to Ruth. Evelyn recognized her grandmother's name and felt the generations suddenly draw closer. Near the bottom lay a thin envelope whose paper had yellowed almost to brown. Anna had written Ruth's name on the front. Evelyn opened it carefully. Most of the letter concerned ordinary matters: health, family visits, repairs at the printing building. Then the tone changed. Anna wrote about preserving the papers and warned Ruth that respectable family histories had a habit of becoming simpler with every retelling. Work became someone else's achievement. Sacrifice became temperament. Silence became consent. Evelyn stopped reading. The words felt uncomfortably modern. Richard was watching her now. "Keep going." Evelyn did. Anna wrote that she did not know who would eventually need the archive, or whether the person had even been born. She only knew the papers should pass to someone who understood why being absent from the official story did not mean a life had been unimportant. The final sentence was underlined once. Evelyn read it silently first, then aloud. "When the time comes, leave these to the daughter who understands what disappearing feels like." Richard said nothing. Neither did Nathan. Evelyn looked around the room at shelves of preserved voices, then back at the century-old letter in her hands. Her mother had directed Evelyn to Box 17 and Anna Mercer. 3 generations earlier, had left instructions for a daughter who knew what it felt like to disappear. Evelyn returned to the archive the next morning with Anna's final sentence still echoing in her mind. "The daughter who understands what disappearing feels like." She had spent most of the night wondering whether Margaret had believed that description belonged to her. Richard arrived later, carrying coffee and a paper bag of breakfast sandwiches, but neither mentioned their argument from the day before. Nathan was already examining several boxes linked to Ruth Mercer's name. "If Anna began the archive," he said, "Ruth appears to have continued it." Evelyn pulled a chair to the reading table. The first folder contained letters written when Ruth was barely 20. Evelyn knew her grandmother mostly as an elderly woman who smelled of lavender soap and kept hard candies in a glass bowl. The young woman in the letters was almost unrecognizable. Ruth wrote quickly, impatiently, often in the margins. She complained about Ashford, dreamed about travel, and described a college she desperately wanted to attend. Evelyn found the acceptance letter folded behind one of Ruth's replies. "She got in," Evelyn said. Richard leaned over her shoulder. "Where?" "A women's college outside Boston." "Did she go?" Evelyn already knew the answer. Ruth had remained in Ashford. The next letters explained why. Her mother became ill. Mercer Printing needed help with accounts. A younger relative required care. None of the reasons alone sounded permanent, but together they slowly closed around Ruth's plans. One letter postponed enrollment for a year. Another said she would apply again. A third stopped mentioning school entirely. Evelyn set it down. She stayed. Richard nodded. "A lot of people did. That doesn't mean she wanted to. I didn't say it did." Evelyn looked at him. Surprised by the lack of resistance, they continued reading. Ruth eventually married. raised children, helped with the family business, and became the person everyone relied on. Her letters grew less restless but not less observant. She wrote often to Margaret, first as a daughter away visiting relatives, later as a young wife and mother. One letter, written when Margaret was in her 20s, caught Evelyn's attention because a sentence had been underlined twice in blue pencil. Ruth wrote, "Do not confuse the fact that a woman can endure something with proof that she was given a choice." Evelyn read it aloud. Richard looked down at his coffee. "That one sounds like Mom." Maybe Mom sounded like her. The distinction mattered more than Evelyn expected. Until now, she had thought of Margaret as a separate figure, her mother, defined by the small world of their house, birthdays, arguments, and all the things left unsaid. These letters placed Margaret inside a longer chain. Nathan found another folder containing Ruth's notes about the archive itself. Some boxes had been relabeled under her direction. Damaged envelopes had been placed inside protective sleeves. She had added handwritten cross-references between Anna's papers and newer family correspondence. She wasn't just saving things, Nathan said. She understood the collection as something that had to remain connected. Connected to what? Richard asked. To the people who came after. Evelyn turned another page. Ruth had written instructions beside several groups of letters: keep together, do not separate, from Anna's account, preserve Margaret's copy. The words were practical, almost plain, but they carried a kind of quiet insistence. Evelyn felt herself becoming uncomfortable for a reason she could not yet name. She had a choice too. Richard said, "About what? About staying?" Evelyn looked at him. Did she? Maybe not a good one, but nobody physically stopped her from leaving. That's not the same as having a real choice. I know. Richard rubbed his thumb along the paper cup. I stayed too. Remember, Evelyn felt the conversation shift. You chose to, at first. He did not explain further, and Evelyn did not push. Before she could answer, the archive door opened. Claire stood there holding a small overnight bag. Evelyn stared at her. What are you doing here? Checking whether my mother has vanished into a 100-year-old paper cave? Claire hugged her, then stepped back. You said you'd probably be home yesterday. Things changed. That's what I figured. Richard greeted his niece warmly. Claire had not been in Ashford for more than a year, and Evelyn immediately felt guilty that her arrival surprised her. I didn't want you to come all this way, Evelyn said. I know. That's usually how you handle everything. The words were light, but Evelyn heard the edge. Later, while Richard and Nathan worked at another shelf, Claire sat beside Evelyn at the reading table. What is all this? She asked. Evelyn showed her Anna's letters, then Ruth's college acceptance. Claire read silently. You never told me Great-Grandma Ruth wanted to go to college. I didn't know. You barely told me anything about this family. Evelyn stiffened. What was I supposed to tell you? Anything? Stories? Names? Why you left Ashford? Why Uncle Richard stayed? Why you hate coming back here? I don't hate coming back. Claire gave her the look she had used since adolescence when she believed her mother was lying politely. Evelyn lowered her voice. I couldn't tell you things nobody told me. You could have told me that. The answer landed harder than Evelyn expected. What do you mean you could have said you didn't know? Instead, you acted like none of it mattered? Evelyn looked toward the shelves. Maybe that was easier. For who? Evelyn did not answer. Claire softened. Mom, I'm not accusing you of anything. I just never understood why your whole family felt like a locked room. Evelyn glanced at the actual locked room around them and almost laughed. Instead, she touched Ruth's letter. Maybe I didn't understand it either. Claire stayed while Evelyn continued through the box. In a later folder, they found correspondence written after Anna's death. Ruth addressed several letters directly to Margaret. Most discussed ordinary family matters, but one referred to the archive in a way that made Evelyn stop. What Claire asked? Evelyn read the passage carefully. Ruth reminded Margaret that the boxes should remain in the print building and that certain personal correspondence must not be discarded, even if other relatives considered it useless. Then came a line Evelyn copied onto her notepad. "You remember the promise we made concerning the room, Richard." Hearing the words from across the table came closer. "What promise?" "It doesn't say." Evelyn searched the rest of the letter. Nothing. She opened the next envelope, then another. Ruth referred to keeping faith with Anna's intentions, but never explained the promise directly. Nathan checked the catalog and found a sequence showing that the archive had passed into Margaret's care after Ruth's death. "So Anna starts it," Claire said. "Ruth protects it. Grandma takes over." Evelyn nodded. 3 generations. Richard frowned at the page. "And nobody thought to tell us?" Evelyn looked at him. "Maybe that was part of the promise." "Then why tell you now?" "I don't know." She hated how often those words had become her answer. Claire rested one hand on Evelyn's arm. "But Grandma clearly wanted you to find out." Evelyn looked again at the sentence. "The promise we made concerning the room." Anna had begun saving the truth because she feared memory would distort it. Ruth had given up choices and then spent decades preserving the evidence of women's lives. Margaret had inherited both the archive and whatever promise bound it together. Evelyn turned to the catalog and followed the handwriting forward until Ruth's entries gave way to Margaret's. The transition was subtle, almost invisible unless someone knew the difference. One woman's hand stopped. Another began. The archive had not merely survived 3 generations. It had been deliberately handed from one to the next. And somewhere inside Margaret's part of that chain was the answer to why the promise had finally ended with Evelyn. Richard arrived at the archive later than usual the next morning, carrying a folder of building invoices under one arm and irritation he made no effort to hide. Claire had gone to get breakfast, and Nathan was downstairs checking the old heating system after noticing a cold draft near the archive wall. Evelyn was alone at the reading table when Richard dropped the folder beside her. "Do you know what this building costs me every month?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the invoices, but did not touch them. "Good morning to you too. Insurance, taxes, repairs, utilities, and that's before something breaks. I didn't ask you to keep the building. No, Dad did." Richard pulled out a chair. "And now your trust owns a room inside it that I apparently can't touch." "I didn't write the trust." "I know." "Then stop talking like I did." He exhaled and sat. "I'm saying we need to decide what happens here. You can't spend 6 months reading every letter while I keep paying for a half-empty building." Evelyn felt the old unfairness rise before she could stop it. "You inherited the building, along with everything that came with it." "Exactly." "What does that mean?" She looked at him. "It means you always got the things that counted." Richard stared at her. "You think these bills don't count? That's not what I said. You think Dad trusted me with real things and gave you leftovers?" Evelyn hesitated because he had named the thought too precisely. "Didn't he?" Richard stood. "You want to trade? What? You want the building, the old equipment, the roof that leaks above the back stairwell, the property tax, the records, the calls every time a pipe freezes? That isn't what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" Evelyn lowered her voice. "You were included. You knew what Dad expected from you. You knew where you stood." Richard laughed without humor. "You call that an advantage?" "Sometimes. I call it never getting to leave." The words stopped her. Richard looked toward the shelves, then back at her. "You left Ashford at 25. You made a career. You married. You raised Claire somewhere else. When Mom died, I was here. When Dad got sick, I was here. When he stopped driving, I drove him."
When he couldn't manage the accounts, I did them. When this building needed repairs,
I handled them because he refused to sell. Evelyn felt defensive immediately. You never told me how bad it was. You called twice a month. You could have asked for help. And you could have asked what was happening. That landed harder than she wanted to admit. I had a child. I had work. So did I. I'm not saying you didn't. It sounds like you are. Evelyn looked away. Richard sat again. Tired now, rather than angry. You remember Dad as the person who chose me. I remember him as the person who kept giving me one more thing to carry because I was already there. Evelyn folded her hands. I thought you wanted it. Sometimes I did. He rubbed his forehead. That's the part nobody likes. You can love a place and resent what it costs you. The sentence reminded her of Ruth immediately. A woman can endure something without having chosen it. Evelyn looked at Richard differently. Not absolved, not suddenly understood, just less simple. Why are you pushing me to decide so quickly? She asked. Because the building is draining money. Only that, he hesitated. Mostly? Richard. He looked toward the door as though considering whether to leave. Instead, he said, Years ago, before Dad died, I suggested clearing some of the upstairs storage, selling anything valuable, donating the rest, including the archive. I didn't know exactly what was in here. I knew Mom kept papers. Evelyn's spine tightened. What did Dad say? Richard's expression changed. That's the strange part. What, he got angry? About the papers, not loud. Dad almost never got loud. He just shut the conversation down. Richard stared at the catalog on the table. I told him the room was taking space and costing money to protect. I said if the documents mattered, we could sell them to a collector or give them to a library. And he said, It isn't mine to sell. Evelyn sat very still. Exactly those words, exactly. But the building was his, yes, and the archive was in it, yes. Then what did he mean? I asked. He wouldn't explain. Evelyn thought of the trust, of Margaret's handwriting on the key, of Anna beginning the archive and Ruth preserving it. Thomas had not treated the room as his property. Even though legally he controlled the building. That mattered. It suggested he had inherited more than paper. He had inherited an obligation. Claire returned carrying coffee and noticed the tension immediately. Did I miss another family argument? A productive one, Richard said. Evelyn almost smiled. Claire set a cup beside her. That sounds dangerous. Nathan came upstairs a few minutes later and reported that the heating vent near the archive needed sealing before winter. Richard muttered something about another bill. Evelyn opened Ruth's later folders while the others discussed the building. Her attention kept returning to Thomas's words. It isn't mine to sell. If he had not believed the archive was his, whose responsibility had he thought it was? She began looking for the transition from Ruth's papers to Margaret's, following the catalog entries they had identified the day before. Several folders contained correspondence between mother and daughter, then increasingly more documents in Margaret's handwriting. Near the back of one box, Evelyn found a group of envelopes tied with faded ribbon. Most were addressed to Ruth. One was not. It was addressed to Thomas Mercer. Evelyn stared at it. Richard. He came over. Claire leaned closer as well. The envelope was in Margaret's handwriting. Across the front, beneath Thomas's name, she had written a short notation regarding Evelyn's trust. Richard frowned. Your trust? Evelyn's pulse quickened. Apparently, but Mom died before Dad. I know. Nathan remained a respectful distance away while Evelyn loosened the ribbon. The envelope had already been opened decades earlier. She slid out the folded letter but did not unfold it immediately. For 18 years,
Evelyn had assumed the trust was Thomas Mercer's final decision controlling. Mysterious and unnecessarily delayed.
Yet Margaret had written to him about it before her death. Richard stared at the words on the envelope. So Dad didn't come up with it alone. Evelyn looked down at her mother's handwriting. Maybe he didn't come up with it at all. Evelyn unfolded Margaret's letter slowly, careful not to crease the old paper along its weakened folds. Richard remained standing beside her, while Claire sat on the opposite side of the reading table, and Nathan quietly moved a lamp closer. The first line removed the last possibility that Thomas had invented the trust on his own. Margaret had written, Thomas, I need you to promise that the archive will be protected for Evelyn until she reaches 60. Evelyn stopped reading. Richard leaned closer. She actually chose the age? Yes. The anger came so quickly, Evelyn almost laughed at herself. For 18 years, she had resented her father for making her wait. She had imagined Thomas sitting with attorneys, deciding that Evelyn could not be trusted with something until an arbitrary age. Now Margaret's handwriting carried the same restriction. Why, Claire asked. Evelyn continued. Margaret wrote that the archive was not to be distributed, divided, sold in pieces, or opened broadly to the public before Evelyn reached the required age. The collection had to remain intact. The room itself had to remain secured. The maintenance account, if Thomas could arrange one, was to cover preservation rather than provide ordinary income. Richard pulled out a chair and sat. That explains why Dad wouldn't let me clear it. Evelyn barely heard him. She was reading faster now, searching for the sentence that would justify 18 years of silence. It did not come. Margaret described the archive as something entrusted first to Anna, then to Ruth, and finally to herself. She wrote that preserving it was not the same as worshiping the past. The papers were meant to survive long enough to reach someone capable of deciding what should happen next. Capable, Evelyn repeated. There it is. Claire frowned. What? The judgment? She didn't think I was capable before 60. That isn't exactly what she wrote. Then why 60? Keep reading. Evelyn did, irritated by Claire's calmness. Margaret said Evelyn might misunderstand the restriction. She might believe the archive had been kept from her because she was untrusted or because Richard mattered more. Margaret admitted that possibility frightened her, but she still believed the collection had to remain intact until the designated time. Evelyn lowered the page. She knew I'd think that and did it anyway. Richard looked uncomfortable. Maybe she had a reason. Then she could have written the reason. Maybe it's in the rest. I'm reading the rest. Evelyn heard the sharpness in her own voice and hated that the letter had made her feel 25 again. She returned to the page. Margaret asked Thomas to resist pressure to sell individual documents, even if collectors offered significant amounts. She specifically warned against separating business records from private letters, because doing so would recreate the same distortion Anna had feared. Nathan nodded when Evelyn read that portion aloud. That was an important instruction. Why, Claire asked. Collections gain meaning from context. One letter by itself may look trivial. Connected to drafts, ledgers, replies, and later correspondence, it can show a pattern. Break everything apart, and you may keep valuable objects while losing the story. Richard looked toward the shelves. So if Dad had sold the newspaper pieces and kept the personal letters, we might never have understood Anna's role. Exactly, Nathan said. Evelyn disliked how sensible Margaret's instructions sounded. Anger would have been easier if the trust had been merely controlling. Instead, every restriction had helped preserve what now surrounded them. Still, the age condition remained unexplained. Margaret's letter ended with an instruction that Thomas should place the archive under trust protection and ensure the key passed only to Evelyn when the condition was satisfied.
The final paragraph was personal, but frustratingly incomplete.
Margaret wrote that she hoped Evelyn would someday understand that being asked to wait was not the same as being denied. Then she signed her name. Evelyn placed the letter flat on the table. "That's it?" Richard asked. "That's it? No explanation for 60 none?" Evelyn pushed back from the table. She knew exactly how I would take this. Claire watched her carefully. "You're angry with Grandma?" "Yes." The admission came easily. "I'm angry that she chose the condition. I'm angry that she understood I already felt secondary and then created something guaranteed to make that worse." "Maybe she thought Dad would explain." Richard shook his head. "Mom knew Dad better than that." Evelyn gave him a humorless smile. "Exactly." She stood and walked toward the window. The heavy curtain remained mostly drawn, leaving only a narrow line of daylight along the floor. 18 years, she said. Dad dies. You inherit things you can actually use. And I get told there's a trust I can't touch until 60. No explanation, no conversation, and now I find out Mom designed it. Claire came closer, but did not touch her. What would you have done if they gave you the archive 18 years ago? Evelyn turned. I don't know. Would you have kept it? That isn't the point. Maybe it is, Claire. I'm not defending her. I'm asking. Evelyn thought of herself at 42. Newly divorced, raising Claire, working longer hours, trying to build enough stability that nobody could accuse her of failing. If someone had handed her a locked room in Ashford full of old family papers, she might have sold whatever could be sold and called it practicality. She disliked the thought immediately. I still deserved to know why. Yes, Claire said. You did. The agreement in Claire's voice softened something Evelyn had been bracing against. Nathan returned to the catalog and traced several entries added during Margaret's lifetime. Whatever else she intended, these restrictions did one measurable thing. Evelyn looked at him. They kept the archive together. Yes, no piecemeal sale, no casual disposal, no public handling before basic preservation. That matters. It doesn't answer why me. No, Nathan said. It doesn't. Richard picked up Margaret's letter again. She says Evelyn would think the archive was being kept from her because I mattered more. He looked at his sister. That's pretty specific. Because she knew, maybe she knew more than we did. Evelyn returned to the table and searched the remaining Margaret folders. If her mother had predicted Evelyn's resentment, perhaps she had left more than one explanation. The first several envelopes contained family correspondence. Another held notes about storage conditions. A later folder included short handwritten reminders to Thomas concerning catalog numbers. Then Evelyn found a page with her own name at the top. She expected another formal instruction. Instead, Margaret had written only a few sentences. Evelyn will be angry, she read softly. Claire leaned in. Richard said nothing. The note continued. She has spent too long believing that leaving Ashford meant there was no place here that belonged to her. If she reads the trust as another proof of that, do not argue with her too soon. Evelyn's throat tightened. She read the next line silently. Margaret had understood something Evelyn herself had rarely put into words. She had not left Ashford only because she wanted independence. Part of her had left because Richard seemed already fitted into the family's future, while Evelyn's role was to be capable somewhere else. Claire touched the edge of the page. Mom, I'm fine. Claire's expression made clear she did not believe her, but she let it pass. Evelyn continued. Margaret wrote that there would come a point when anger might make Evelyn stop reading entirely. If that happened, the next step had already been chosen. Richard leaned over. What step? Evelyn read the final sentence aloud. When Evelyn is angry enough to stop reading, give her Ruth's blue box. Silence followed. Nathan looked toward the shelving. Claire exhaled slowly. She predicted this. Evelyn stared at the sentence, unsettled by how precisely Margaret had anticipated her. Richard checked the catalog while Evelyn scanned the shelf labels. Several minutes later, Claire found it on a lower cabinet. A narrow archival box covered in faded blue cloth. She carried it carefully to the table. No dates appeared on the lid. No explanation. Only Ruth Mercer's name. And beneath it, in Margaret's handwriting, one word: Evelyn. Evelyn sat with Ruth's blue box in front of her for several minutes before lifting the lid. The cloth covering was faded at the corners, and the cardboard beneath had softened slightly with age. But Nathan had already confirmed the contents appeared stable. Inside were 3 bundles of letters separated by thin sheets of archival paper. Each bundle carried a name and a range of dates. Anna, Ruth, Margaret. Evelyn stared at them. "These aren't all Ruth's," Claire said. "No," Evelyn replied. "They're grouped by age." Richard leaned closer. The dates covered the same stage of life for all 3 women, their late 50s through the beginning of their 60s. Nathan noticed it too. "That's deliberate." Evelyn looked at the box again. "So this is why Mom called it Ruth's blue box." "Maybe Ruth started it," Claire said. Evelyn opened Anna's bundle first. The letters were written decades after the earliest documents in Box 17. Anna was older now, no longer the restless young woman building systems to preserve what others ignored. Her handwriting had become more deliberate. In one letter, she described reading an anniversary history of Mercer Printing that praised her husband as the sole force behind the company's growth. Anna did not rage. That almost made the words hurt more. She wrote, "I was present for every decision they now remember as his. I corrected the proofs they call his judgment. I balanced the ledgers they call his discipline. I do not require applause, but I confess I am tired of being absent from rooms where I spent my life." Evelyn stopped. Claire looked at her. "That's why she started saving everything." Evelyn nodded. Anna went on to say that reaching 60 had changed the way she thought about recognition. As a younger woman, she had assumed there would always be time for the truth to become obvious. By 60, she understood that omission could harden into history. If she did not preserve her own evidence, someone else's simpler version would survive. Richard shifted uneasily. She really believed she was being erased? She was, Evelyn said. This time he did not argue. The next bundle belonged to Ruth. Her letters at roughly the same age carried a different kind of regret. She did not write about disappearing from history. She wrote about choices never made. Ruth described seeing former classmates travel, teach, and build careers elsewhere while she remained in Ashford. She was careful not to describe her life as miserable. She loved parts of it deeply. That distinction mattered, one letter to Margaret read. A life may be good and still contain doors one was never permitted to open. Evelyn read the sentence twice. Richard looked toward the floor. Another letter returned to the college acceptance Ruth had once set aside. At 59. She found the old document while clearing a drawer. She wrote that she no longer wanted the life she might have had, but she wanted the truth of that lost choice preserved. I do not wish my granddaughters to mistake my staying for proof that I never wanted to go. Claire looked at Evelyn. Granddaughters? Evelyn felt a faint pressure in her chest. She knew there would be women after her, or hoped there would be. They moved slowly through Ruth's letters. At 60, Ruth seemed less interested in blaming anyone than in naming what had happened accurately. She wrote about duty, love, resentment, gratitude, and how often those feelings occupied the same room. Evelyn thought immediately of Richard.
He had said almost the same thing about Ashford loving a place and resenting what it cost. When Evelyn looked at him, he seemed to know what she was thinking.
Don't say it. I wasn't going to. You were. Claire smiled faintly.
For once, the tension eased rather than sharpened. Margaret's bundle was last. Evelyn hesitated before opening it. Her anger from the previous day had not disappeared, if anything. Knowing Margaret had planned for it made the feeling harder to dismiss. The first letters were not addressed to Evelyn.
They were private reflections, some apparently written to Ruth before Ruth died, others kept without envelopes. Margaret wrote about raising Richard and Evelyn differently, without recognizing it at first. Richard, she said, was praised for responsibility. Evelyn was praised for adaptability. Richard was told he would someday understand the business, the building, the family obligations. Evelyn was told she would do well anywhere. That doesn't sound terrible, Richard said quietly. No, Evelyn replied. That's why it worked. She continued. Margaret wrote that compliments could become assignments. Richard learned that belonging meant carrying responsibility. Evelyn learned that being capable meant needing less from home. One page had been marked with a blue line near the bottom. Evelyn read silently until the words blurred. Claire noticed. What does it say? Evelyn tried to answer and had to clear her throat first. It says, we mistook her independence for permission to leave. No place for her. No one spoke. Evelyn pressed her lips together, but the tears came anyway. She hated crying in front of people, especially when she could not control the reason. Claire moved beside her and put one arm around her shoulders. Evelyn almost said she was fine. The familiar phrase formed automatically. Then she stopped herself. I spent years thinking they preferred him, she said. Richard looked stricken. Evelyn, I know you didn't ask for that. Still, I thought every time Dad called you about the building, every time Mom asked you to handle something, every time I came home and everybody already knew what was happening except me. It meant you were the real child, and I was visiting. Richard lowered his eyes. Claire tightened her arm around Evelyn. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me that Evelyn wiped her face? Because it sounded pathetic. It doesn't. It did to me. Claire shook her head. You always act like needing anything makes you weak. The sentence was gentle, but it struck harder than accusation. Evelyn looked at the letters in front of her. Anna feared disappearing. Ruth feared her unchosen sacrifices would be rewritten as preference. Margaret feared she had taught Evelyn to confuse self-sufficiency with worth. The same pattern had changed shape across generations without ever fully leaving the family. Evelyn returned to Margaret's pages. The next entries became more explicit about age. Margaret wrote that something shifted for Anna near 60, and later for Ruth. Not wisdom exactly, perspective. The distance between what they had once expected and what their lives had actually become was finally large enough to see clearly. Margaret herself had begun rereading the archive in her late 50s and recognized the pattern only then. This is the age, Evelyn said. Claire leaned closer. What the reason for 60? She spread the 3 bundles across the table. Anna started writing about being erased around 60. Ruth started writing about the choices she lost around 60. Mom started understanding all of this around the same age. Richard looked at Margaret's letter. So she wanted you to be where they were, not physically. Evelyn touched Anna's bundle. In life, the restriction no longer looked completely arbitrary. That did not make it painless. Margaret had still chosen silence. She had still made Evelyn wait. But 60 was not a punishment invented to keep her out. It was a point of connection deliberately chosen between women who had reached the same stretch of life and looked backward with new clarity.
At the bottom of Margaret's bundle lay one final sealed envelope. Unlike the others,
It had never been opened. Evelyn's name was written on the front. Beneath it was a single instruction: to be read only after Evelyn understands why 60 mattered. Evelyn rested both hands on the table for the first time since receiving the trust letter. She did understand. She looked at Anna's words, Ruth's regrets, and Margaret's confession, then at the sealed envelope waiting before her. 60 had never been the age when her family finally decided she was trustworthy. It was the age when 3 women before her had finally understood their own lives clearly enough to leave the truth behind. And now Margaret had expected Evelyn to do the same. Evelyn waited until the room was quiet before opening the envelope. Nathan had moved to the far shelves to inspect a damaged box, and Richard and Claire sat across from her without speaking. Margaret's handwriting on the front looked steadier than some of the later notes, suggesting she had prepared this letter well before her final illness. Evelyn slipped a finger beneath the flap and unfolded 3 pages. "My dear Evelyn," she read softly. The next sentence made her stop. "If you are 60 when you read this, then I have asked you to wait a very long time, and you have every right to be angry with me for it." Evelyn almost laughed. At least she knew. Claire touched her hand. "Keep going." Marg wrote that 60 had never been intended as a test of maturity. She did not believe Evelyn irresponsible at 40 or unworthy at 50. She had chosen the age because Anna, Ruth, and Margaret herself had each reached a turning point around then. Anna had finally understood how easily her work could disappear from the family story. Ruth had finally found words for the difference between a life willingly chosen and a life accepted because duty left little room for alternatives. Margaret, approaching the same age, had begun reading their letters differently. As a younger woman, she had treated them as family papers. Later, she saw women speaking across time. Evelyn lowered the page. That distinction unsettled her because it matched her own experience exactly. A week earlier, Anna and Ruth had been names attached to dead relatives. Now Evelyn could imagine Anna correcting proofs late at night and Ruth folding away a college acceptance she would never use. Margaret continued, "I believed that if you received the archive too young, you might see only what Richard received and what you did not." Richard shifted in his chair. Evelyn read on silently for several lines. Her mother admitted she feared Evelyn would regard the archive as another inferior inheritance, old papers instead of property, memories instead of something useful. Worse, financial pressure might make selling or dividing it seem like the only sensible response before Evelyn understood what connected the documents. Evelyn felt resistance rise again. She decided what younger me would have done. "Yes," Claire said. She did. There was no defense in her voice. Evelyn appreciated that. Margaret's next paragraph surprised her. "I may be wrong." Evelyn read those words aloud. Margaret acknowledged that choosing an age for another adult was an act of control, even if done with love. Evelyn might reach 60 and still resent the decision. She might conclude Margaret had preserved the archive at the cost of hurting her daughter. "If that is your judgment," Margaret wrote, "I will not be there to argue with you. And perhaps that is only fair." Richard exhaled. Mom admitting she might be wrong. "We should preserve that page separately." Evelyn gave him a look, then smiled despite herself. The humor lasted only a moment. Margaret explained why the collection had to remain intact until Evelyn could see it in context. Anna's business records meant little without her private letters about disappearing from the official history. Ruth's decision to stay in Ashford could be romanticized without the acceptance letter proving another future had once been available. Margaret's own choices as a mother could be softened if her regrets were removed from the family papers. "The truth is rarely in one letter," she wrote. It is in what survives beside it. Nathan looked over from the shelves. She understood archives. She understood this one. Evelyn said, "The final page was more personal. Margaret wrote that she did not expect Evelyn to preserve everything forever, simply because Anna and Ruth had preserved it before her. That would turn inheritance into obligation," repeating the very pattern the letters warned against. Evelyn read that sentence twice. "She isn't asking me to keep it." "Apparently not," Richard said. Margaret was explicit. When the trust opened, the decision had to belong to Evelyn. She could preserve the archive, transfer it responsibly, make portions accessible, or decide that its purpose had been fulfilled. Margaret asked only that Evelyn first understand what she was deciding about. "I did not keep these papers so the dead could control you," Margaret wrote. "I kept them so the dead could speak before you chose whether to carry their voices farther." Evelyn placed the page down. For days, she had thought the archive was a message with a predetermined answer. Keep this, protect us, be grateful. Instead, Margaret had preserved a choice. Claire seemed to reach the same conclusion. "She wasn't giving you a job." "No." Evelyn looked around at the shelves. "She was giving me the decision." Richard folded his arms. "That's still a job. A different one." Nathan returned to the table carrying the trust folder Caroline Webb had given Evelyn on her birthday. There may be something relevant to that distinction. Earlier, Evelyn had asked him to compare the preservation restrictions in Margaret's letters with the maintenance provisions in the trust. He opened the folder to a section Evelyn had skimmed during the first meeting. "I'm not an attorney," he said, "so Caroline should confirm the legal meaning. But this doesn't describe the archive as loose contents you simply receive." He pointed to the beneficiary provision. Evelyn read it carefully. "The trust controlled the Mercer family archive, the archive room, and specified rights associated with the portion of the Mercer Print Building necessary for the collection's continued use and access." Upon Evelyn reaching 60, those beneficiary rights shifted into her control, subject to the legal structure of the building. Richard leaned over the document. "What does that mean for me?" we asked Caroline. Evelyn said, "We don't guess." She called from the archive. Caroline confirmed the basic point without attempting to settle details over the phone. The trust had been structured so Evelyn's inheritance was not merely ownership of boxes. She now held decision-making authority over the archive and legal rights connected to the room's continued access and use. Any permanent change involving that portion of the building would require consideration of her rights. Richard's expression tightened. "So I own the building, but I can't just clear this floor." Caroline's voice came through the speaker. "Not in a way that defeats the trust rights now vested in Evelyn. We should review the documents together before either of you makes changes." After the call, Richard walked toward the window. "Dad really locked this down. Mom asked him to, and now you control it." Evelyn looked at Margaret's letter a few days earlier. That fact might have felt like an overdue victory. Richard had inherited tangible things. Now she finally possessed leverage over something connected to the family property. But the letters had already made that comparison feel smaller. "I don't know what I'm going to do with it," she said. Richard turned. "You could sell it, maybe. You could donate it, maybe. You could leave everything exactly as it is." Evelyn nodded. "That's the point." Claire looked between them. "What is—" Evelyn touched the final page of Margaret's letter. "Nobody gets to decide for me now." She understood at last why Margaret's instructions had ended at 60 rather than continuing for Evelyn's lifetime. The trust had not been designed to force permanent preservation. It had been designed to keep the archive whole long enough to reach her. Anna had started it. Ruth had carried it. Margaret had protected it. Thomas had enforced the restriction after Margaret was gone. But the chain did not automatically make Evelyn its next keeper. For the first time,
The choice was open. She looked around the room differently. Every shelf represented something 3 generations had refused to let disappear. Yet nothing in Margaret's final letter demanded a 4th generation do the same. Evelyn could preserve the archive. She could transfer it. She could even allow parts of it to leave the room under whatever legal options Caroline confirmed. The unsettling truth was that there was no longer anyone to blame for what happened next. The archive had survived long enough to become Evelyn's decision. The first serious offer arrived 3 days later. Evelyn had expected questions from local historians after Nathan contacted 2 people about preservation standards. But she had not expected money. Caroline Webb called shortly before noon and asked whether Evelyn could come to her office. Richard went with her. Claire stayed at the archive, cataloging several folders Nathan had already cleared for handling. Caroline placed a printed letter on the conference table. A private historical collection heard that the Mercer archive may contain early regional printing material, family correspondence, and unpublished writings. Evelyn looked at Nathan, who had joined them by phone. "Did you contact them?" "No," he said, "but archival circles are small. Someone asks about storage requirements. People become curious," Caroline continued. "They are offering to purchase the archive as a complete collection, together with whatever rights to the archive room and associated building access can legally be transferred." Richard leaned forward. "How much?" Caroline turned the document. Evelyn saw the number and stopped breathing for a moment. It was enough to pay the increased rent on her shop for years. More than that. It was enough to clear several business debts, replace aging equipment, and leave a cushion she had not had since before her divorce. "That's for the papers," Richard asked. "For the collection and related rights." Caroline said, "Subject to appraisal and title review." Evelyn read the number again. A week earlier, she had driven into Ashford ashamed of hoping the trust contained money. Now money had appeared anyway. Hidden inside the value of what she had nearly dismissed as a room full of old paper? Richard looked at her. "You have to consider this. I mean seriously." "I know what you mean." Caroline warned them that the offer did not require an immediate answer, but would not remain open indefinitely. The buyer wanted assurance that the collection would stay intact during evaluation. "They're not asking to split it up?" Evelyn asked. "Not initially." Nathan's voice came through the speaker. "Initially matters." Evelyn looked toward the phone. "Explain." "A collection can be purchased intact and later separated. Individual letters, signed documents, printing ephemera, early business records. Different parts may have different market value. Private ownership does not guarantee the relationships between the materials remain visible." Richard frowned. "You're telling her not to sell?" "No, I'm telling her what could happen if she does. The decision is hers." Evelyn appreciated the distinction. Richard did not. "That's easy to say when you're not paying for the room." Nathan stayed calm. "Correct, which is why I'm not making the decision." The drive back to the Mercer Print Building was quiet. Richard finally spoke when they were parked outside. "That offer could solve your shop problem." Evelyn turned to him. "How do you know about the shop?" "Claire told me the rent is going up. Irritation came first, then embarrassment. She shouldn't have." "Why?" "Because you prefer everyone believing you're fine." Evelyn looked away. Richard softened slightly. "You need the money." "So do you. This isn't my asset. The building rights affect you, yes. And if selling the archive reduces what I have to maintain." "I'm not going to pretend that means nothing." Evelyn studied him. "You want me to sell?" "I think you should consider whether protecting dead people's letters is worth damaging your living." The sentence followed her upstairs. Claire was sitting at the reading table beside 3 open catalog sheets. "How bad?" she asked. "Why did you tell Richard about my rent?"
Claire closed her eyes briefly. So that's how the meeting went, Claire, because you weren't telling anyone. And then you came here talking about making decisions that affect money while pretending money isn't part of it. It's my business, exactly. Your business is in trouble. Evelyn sat opposite her. The offer is large. How large? Evelyn told her. Claire stared. Oh, yes. That would save the shop, probably. Then are you going to sell? I don't know. Claire looked toward the shelves. Do you want to keep the archive? I don't know that either. That's different. How? You might keep it because you love what it means, or because Grandma made you feel responsible for it. Those aren't the same thing, Evelyn bristled. Margaret specifically said I didn't owe the dead anything. Knowing that and feeling it are different. Evelyn started to argue, then stopped. Claire was right. Every time she imagined accepting the offer, she saw Margaret's handwriting, Anna's drafts, Ruth's college letter. She could not tell whether that resistance came from attachment or guilt. Nathan arrived later with humidity readings and a list of materials needing better folders. Evelyn showed him the offer. He read the relevant terms and returned it without expression. Well, she asked. Financially, it's serious. And archivally, if the buyer keeps the collection intact and provides professional care, selling is not inherently destructive. But if it is later divided, context disappears. He pointed toward the shelves. Anna's newspaper drafts matter because the business histories excluded her. Ruth's acceptance letter matters because later family stories might describe her staying as preference. Margaret's letters matter because they connect those patterns to you. Separate the valuable pieces from the ordinary ones, and the ordinary ones may be exactly what disappears first. Evelyn looked at the rows of boxes. So one fancy letter survives, and the evidence around it doesn't? Possibly. And if I keep everything, you inherit the practical problem too: storage, building costs, conservation, access decisions, cataloging. Preservation is not free simply because the papers are already here. That honesty helped. Evelyn had no desire to turn the archive into a sacred object whose preservation justified any cost. She spent the rest of the afternoon reading without deciding anything. Near dusk, she returned to one of Anna's later folders, hoping the older woman's words might clarify what obligation meant. Most of the correspondence concerned family matters. Then she found a letter addressed to Ruth, written after Anna had already established the archive. The first page discussed household accounts and a relative's illness. Near the end, Anna turned to the papers. Evelyn read slowly. Do not preserve my papers because I was your mother. Preserve only what may help the next woman understand she was not the first. Evelyn sat back. The words unsettled her because they removed the easiest justification for keeping everything. Anna had not wanted reverence. She had not asked Ruth to preserve every scrap out of loyalty. She had wanted the archive to serve someone living. Claire came to stand beside her. What did you find out? Evelyn handed her the letter. Claire read the sentence and looked up. That sounds like your answer. No. Evelyn took the letter back. It sounds like a harder question, which is... Evelyn looked around the room differently. For days, she had been asking whether the archive deserved to survive because 3 generations had worked to preserve it. Anna had just stripped away that logic. The archive was not valuable merely because it was old. Its value depended on whether the connected stories could still help someone understand a life like our own. If that purpose remained alive, preserving it mattered. If not, keeping it out of guilt would betray the very woman who started it. Evelyn looked down at the offer on the table, then at Anna's sentence beside it. The choice was no longer between money and family loyalty. It was between 2 different ideas of what preserving a legacy actually meant. Evelyn returned to the archive early the next morning, before Richard or Claire arrived. The private buyer's offer sat folded inside her bag, but she did not take it out. Instead, she opened the trust folder and searched for the final documents connected to Thomas Mercer. Until now, her father had existed in the story mostly as the man who enforced Margaret's wishes after she died.
Evelyn still did not know how willingly he had done it. Nathan had identified several envelopes in a later box as Thomas's correspondence concerning the trust. Evelyn placed them on the reading table one by one. The first was a letter from Caroline Webb's predecessor confirming that Thomas had asked for advice on creating a restricted family trust.
The second contained handwritten notes in Thomas's precise block lettering. Evelyn recognized the habit immediately. Her father had always written as if every sentence might become a legal document. Richard arrived while she was reading. "You started without me. I wasn't sure you wanted more letters. I'm committed now." He set 2 coffees on the table. "What did you find?" Evelyn handed him Thomas's notes. He read silently. Several lines concerned maintenance costs, security, and whether the archive could legally remain connected to one room inside the Mercer Print Building. Then Richard stopped. He argued about 60. Evelyn leaned closer. Thomas had written that requiring Evelyn to wait until that age seemed excessive. He worried she would interpret the restriction as punishment or distrust. "So he knew too," Evelyn said. "He knew how it would look," Richard kept reading. "He wanted 50. That would have saved me 10 years of resentment." "Only 10? She gave him a look. Not helping. Another document was a draft letter from Thomas to Margaret. It appeared never to have been mailed, perhaps written while she was still alive but already ill. Thomas questioned whether they had the right to decide when an adult daughter would be prepared to receive family property. He wrote that Evelyn had always resisted being managed and that the restriction might drive her farther from Ashford rather than bring her closer. Evelyn sat back. Dad defended me. Richard looked surprised too. Apparently. She felt an unexpected ache. For years, she had cast Thomas as the architect of the trust because his signature appeared on the legal documents. She had imagined him deciding that Evelyn could not be trusted until 60. Now she saw him arguing against the very condition she had blamed him for. "Why did he agree?" Richard asked. The answer lay in another envelope. Margaret's reply was shorter than the other letters Evelyn had read. She acknowledged Thomas's objections and did not deny the condition might hurt Evelyn, but she returned to the pattern of Anna and Ruth. Around 60. Each woman had reached the point where she could look at her life without pretending every sacrifice had been chosen or every silence harmless. Margaret wrote that Evelyn would need distance from the family story before the archive could become something other than proof of unfairness. "That still sounds like she was making a decision for you," Richard said. "She was—" Evelyn turned the page. Margaret had anticipated that criticism. She wrote that perhaps the choice was imperfect, but allowing the archive to be divided earlier would be irreversible. If Evelyn eventually rejected the archive at 60, that decision could still be honored if the papers were sold in pieces at 42. No later understanding could put them back together. Thomas had underlined that paragraph. That's probably what convinced him. Evelyn said. Richard nodded slowly. Delay could be reversed. Destruction couldn't. The next document confirmed it. Thomas wrote to the attorney that he would honor Margaret's request, provided the trust preserved Evelyn's eventual freedom to decide. He insisted that, once the age condition ended, no dead relative should be able to compel her to keep the collection permanently. Richard glanced at Evelyn. That sounds like the language Caroline explained. Yes. They continued through the file. Thomas's role became clearer with every page. After Margaret died, he maintained the room, paid for preservation work, resisted Richard's suggestion to sell, and updated the trust when building expenses changed. He had not invented the promise, but he had carried it for years without telling either child the full reason. That silence still hurt Evelyn. Understanding it did not erase the cost. Richard seemed to sense what she was thinking. You can still be angry with him. Evelyn looked at her brother. I am. Good, she almost laughed. You sound relieved. I don't want this to become one of those family stories where the dead leave a letter and suddenly everyone realizes they were perfect. They weren't.
Mom controlled something that should have been yours earlier.
Dad agreed to it and explained nothing.
They may have had reasons, but reasons aren't the same as innocence.
Evelyn stared at him. When did you become reasonable? Probably around 60. You're 64. I'm a slow learner. Their laughter faded into a gentler silence. Evelyn found one final sheet beneath the correspondence. It was not formally addressed. Thomas had written only her name at the top. Evelyn recognized the paper as the same stationery he kept in his desk at home. This one's for me. Richard stood. Do you want privacy? Evelyn considered it. No, stay. She unfolded the page. Thomas wrote that if Evelyn had reached the archive, then Margaret's condition had been fulfilled. He offered no defense of the trust's age requirement. Instead, he admitted that he had agreed to preserve something he did not fully understand because Margaret understood its history better than he did. He wrote that the archive had belonged, in practice, to a chain of women before him, and that his task was temporary. The final paragraph was only 4 sentences. Evelyn read the last one twice before speaking. What Richard asked, she turned the page so he could see. Thomas had written, Evelyn owes the dead nothing. The choice must remain hers. Richard sat back down. That's pretty clear. Evelyn felt the pressure she had been carrying since opening the trust shift slightly. Margaret had told her much the same thing, but hearing it from Thomas mattered. The father she had blamed for controlling her inheritance had taken deliberate steps to ensure the control ended with him. He really meant it, she said. Apparently, Richard looked toward the shelves, and he didn't leave it to me because he knew it wasn't mine. Evelyn nodded. He thought it belonged in that line. Anna, Ruth, Mom, then me. Richard was quiet for a long moment. I used to think you left because you didn't care about any of this. Evelyn looked at him. The building, the family, Ashford, Mom and Dad, me. I cared too much. Richard frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means every time I came back, I felt like you already had the place I might have wanted. Dad called you about the business, Mom called you about repairs, you knew what needed doing before I even arrived. I thought staying would mean being the extra person in my own family. I never knew that. I never told you. Why, Evelyn gave him a tired smile. Because apparently, I inherited a family tradition of not saying important things until decades later. Richard looked down at his hands. I thought you had freedom. I envied you for it. I thought you had belonging. I envied you for that. Their eyes met. Neither interpretation had been entirely wrong. Neither had been complete. Claire arrived carrying breakfast and paused when she saw them sitting quietly together. Should I be worried? Probably, Richard said. Evelyn folded Thomas's note and returned it to the folder. Her phone vibrated inside her bag. Caroline's name appeared on the screen. Evelyn answered. I spoke with the buyer, Caroline said. They need your decision tomorrow morning. They're preparing another acquisition and won't hold the funds past then. Evelyn looked at the shelves, then at Thomas's final words. The choice must remain hers. Tomorrow morning, she repeated. Richard watched her closely. Caroline confirmed the deadline and ended the call. Evelyn set the phone down. After 3 generations of letters, 18 years of waiting, and a week spent discovering why the archive had survived, there was nothing left to uncover before she decided, by tomorrow morning,
Evelyn would have to choose what happened to it. Evelyn arrived at the Mercer Print Building before sunrise, carrying a notebook, 3 letters, and the private buyer's offer folded inside her bag. The second floor was cold enough that her breath briefly showed when she opened the archive door. She switched on the table lamp instead of the overhead lights. The room looked different in the dimness, less like a collection and more like a place where people had been waiting. She placed Anna's letter on the table first. It was the one in which Anna wrote that she was tired of being absent from rooms where she had spent her life. Evelyn read it slowly, though she knew most of the lines now. Anna had not asked to be made important after death. She had asked not to be erased. Evelyn placed Ruth's letter beside it. Ruth wrote that she did not want later generations to mistake her staying in Ashford for proof that she had never wanted another life. She had loved parts of the life she lived. She had also lost choices. Both truths belonged together. The third letter was Margaret's. Evelyn had chosen the passage she found hardest to read without feeling exposed. We mistook her independence for permission to leave no place for her. She sat alone with the 3 pages arranged in front of her. Anna wanted her work remembered accurately. Ruth wanted her choices named honestly. Margaret wanted Evelyn to understand that being treated as though she needed less had never meant she deserved less room in the family. For days, Evelyn had treated herself as the end point of those messages, the person selected to receive them. That morning, for the first time, she noticed what was absent from the archive. There was no Evelyn Mercer box. No account of the woman who left Ashford at 25 because staying felt like occupying someone else's future. No letter explaining why she had built a career restoring damaged books while refusing to admit when her own life felt fragile. No record of the divorce that had taught her to answer every offer of help with, "I can handle it." No explanation for Claire of why her mother had spent years turning silence into a form of independence. Evelyn opened the notebook she had brought. The first page remained blank for several minutes. Then she wrote Claire's name. She did not begin with advice. Advice felt too much like another attempt to control what someone later should understand. Instead, she wrote the truth. She told Claire that leaving Ashford had felt exciting and necessary, but also like surrendering a place she believed had already been assigned to Richard. She wrote that she had spent years telling herself she preferred distance because admitting she wanted to belong would have made rejection more painful. She admitted that during her marriage, she learned to make herself useful before asking whether she was happy. After the marriage ended, usefulness became armor. If she needed nothing, nobody could deny her anything. Evelyn stopped and pressed her fingers against her eyes. The room remained quiet. She wrote about Claire next. "I thought protecting you meant never making you responsible for my fear," she wrote. "Sometimes I protected you so well that I also kept you outside." That sentence hurt enough that she almost crossed it out. She left it. She told Claire about the shop's finances. Not in numbers, but in truth. She had been frightened for months, and ashamed that a business built through years of careful work could be threatened by something as ordinary as rent. She admitted she had hidden the problem because she wanted Claire to see her as stable. Then she wrote, "If these letters teach you anything about me, I hope it is not that I was strong. I hope it is that strength and silence are not the same thing." When she finished, the sky beyond the narrow window had turned pale gray. Evelyn read the letter once, folded it, and wrote a date on the envelope. She did not seal it. The archive door opened behind her. Richard stepped inside carrying 2 coffees. "I thought you might be here." Evelyn covered the letter instinctively, then stopped herself and moved her hand away. Richard noticed, "Private." Eventually, he set the coffee beside her and looked at the 3 old letters, making the decision. He pulled out the chair opposite her,
Do you want me to leave? No. Evelyn looked around the room. I kept thinking this archive ends with me. Because Mom left it to you? Yes. But that isn't what Anna built. Richard waited. Evelyn touched the letter she had written. She kept things so the next woman would understand she wasn't the first. Ruth did the same. Mom did the same. They weren't closing a collection, they were continuing one. Richard looked at the envelope. You wrote something? To Claire? Are you planning to hide it for 40 years? Evelyn smiled. No. Good. We have enough traditions. She laughed softly, then became serious again. I don't want to sell the archive. Richard's expression changed, though not with surprise. You're sure? I'm sure I don't want that buyer to own it. That's not exactly the same thing. No, it isn't. Evelyn appreciated him making the distinction. I don't want to keep it because Mom told me to. She didn't. I don't want to keep it because Anna started it, or because Ruth sacrificed things for it. I want to keep it because when I read these letters, I stopped thinking my life was some private failure nobody else could understand. She looked at Anna's page. The details are different, but the pattern isn't. Richard folded his hands around his coffee. Keeping it will cost money. I know, and work. I know, and the building problem doesn't disappear. I know that too. Richard nodded. Then I'm not going to argue. Evelyn studied him. You were the one telling me to sell. I was telling you to consider it. You were more enthusiastic than that. Fair. He looked toward the shelves. I still don't know what this place becomes, but I understand now why selling it in one piece to someone who might break it apart later is different from solving the practical problems ourselves. Evelyn felt a small release in her chest. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'm still sending you half the heating bill if your rights cover half this floor. We'll let Caroline fight about that. Richard smiled. Then his expression softened. Dad's note was right. Which part? The choice must remain hers? Evelyn looked down at her own letter. I think I finally believe him. Claire arrived about an hour later. She found Evelyn and Richard comparing maintenance figures at the table. That looks terrifying. It is, Richard said. Claire set down a bag of pastries. Did you decide? Evelyn glanced at her. Yes, Claire said, and I'm not selling to the private collection. Claire's eyes searched her face. Because you feel guilty? No. Evelyn took the new envelope from beneath the notebook and slid it across the table. Because I think this place still has work to do. Claire looked at her name written on the front. What's this? Something I should have told you without needing an archive to teach me how. Claire did not open it. Do you want me to read it now? Whenever you want. That answer seemed to matter. Claire placed the envelope carefully beside her. Richard stood and gave them room by walking toward the shelves. Claire looked around the archive. So what happens now? Evelyn thought about Anna's warning against preserving things simply because they belonged to family. She thought about Ruth insisting that lost choices deserved accurate names. She thought about Margaret refusing to let the dead control Evelyn's final decision. We figure out how to keep the parts that matter connected, she said, and we stop pretending preservation means hiding everything forever. Claire nodded slowly. That sounds like a lot of work. It probably is, Evelyn smiled. I've done worse things with paper. Later that morning, Richard returned with the private buyer's offer in his hand. Caroline needs an answer. Evelyn looked at the number one final time. It could protect her shop. It could make several immediate fears disappear. Saying no did not make those fears imaginary. That mattered too. She took out her phone and called Caroline. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Evelyn declined the offer. When she ended the call, the room did not transform. The bills still existed. The building still needed repairs.
The archive still required decisions she had not yet made, but the choice had been hers, and she had made it for the living, not the dead. Richard picked up Evelyn's newly written envelope and read only the name on the front. "So what do we call this?" Evelyn took it back and placed it beside Anna. Ruth and Margaret. 3 generations had preserved enough truth for her to recognize herself. She was not the last person standing at the end of their story. She was the next person responsible for deciding what truth should move forward. Richard looked at her. "What are you going to do with all this?" Evelyn rested one hand on the table, surrounded by the voices that had waited for her to reach them. "What they did," she said, "keep it alive." The first change Evelyn made to the archive was not dramatic. She bought better folders. Nathan helped her identify the papers most vulnerable to light, moisture, and handling, and together they created a preservation schedule that fit the maintenance account instead of pretending money did not matter. Some historical business records and selected correspondence were approved for careful digitization, allowing local researchers to study them without repeatedly handling the originals. The most personal letters remained protected. Accessible doesn't have to mean exposed, Nathan told her. Evelyn liked that distinction. It applied to more than paper. Caroline Webb handled the harder problem, the Mercer Print Building. Evelyn's trust rights could not remain an inconvenience Richard carried indefinitely, and Richard's ownership could not become a reason the archive was treated as someone else's burden. After several meetings, they restructured use of the second floor. Richard retained his ownership interests and the areas he needed. The archive room remained under Evelyn's management, with clear access and maintenance responsibilities recorded in writing. A smaller room beside it was available for Evelyn's use. The first time she stood inside that empty room, she saw peeling paint, 2 scarred work tables, and a window overlooking Ashford's brick rooftops. Richard stood in the doorway. "Not exactly glamorous." Evelyn ran a hand across one of the tables. "Neither is my current shop. What are you thinking?" She looked through the open doorway toward the archive. "My lease is going up again." Richard understood before she finished. Moving her bookbinding work into the Mercer Print Building would reduce her overhead dramatically. More importantly, it placed her restoration work beside the collection she had chosen to preserve. "Dad would have opinions," Richard said. "Dad had opinions about everything. Mom, too. We're going to have to learn to survive without their approval." Richard smiled. "At our age, especially at our age." The move took 6 weeks. Evelyn did not bring everything from her old shop, only the equipment she used most: presses, hand tools, cutting mats, book cloth, repair papers, and the wooden stool Claire had painted for her years earlier. On the first morning she worked there, the smell of paste mixed faintly with the old paper and wood of the building. Mercer Printing had once put words onto paper. Evelyn now repaired paper so words could survive. She resisted making too much of the symmetry. Claire did not. "You realize this is painfully appropriate," she said while carrying a box of supplies upstairs. "I'm choosing not to realize it. That doesn't make it less true." Claire had begun helping with the archive catalog on weekends. Their conversations changed slowly. Evelyn told her when a client paid late instead of saying business was fine. She admitted when she was tired. Claire, in return, stopped interpreting every silence as rejection. One afternoon, Evelyn found the letter she had written to Claire sitting open on the archive table. "You read it?" Claire nodded. 3 times. Evelyn waited. "I wish you'd told me some of that earlier." "So do I. Especially about the divorce." Evelyn looked down. "I thought keeping the ugly parts away from you was protecting you."
I know. Claire folded the letter carefully.
But sometimes it made me think you didn't trust me with the truth. Evelyn felt the old instinct to explain herself, then let it go. I'm sorry.
Claire reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Nothing was magically repaired by the gesture. That made it feel more real. Richard changed, too, though in ways he rarely announced.
While reorganizing an old downstairs display about Mercer Printing, he found a historical panel crediting Anna's husband almost entirely with the company's early growth. Anna's name appeared only in a family caption. Richard carried the panel upstairs. This is exactly what she wrote about. Evelyn examined it. Yes, we've had this hanging downstairs for years. I know. I walked past it thousands of times. A week later, Richard replaced it. The revised display named Anna alongside her husband and described her documented work in accounts, editing, and unsigned writing for the paper. He included reproductions of 2 records from Box 17. Evelyn found him mounting the final panel. You didn't have to do that. Richard stepped back to straighten it. Apparently somebody did. It was the closest either of them came to apologizing for a history they had inherited rather than created. By the time Evelyn turned 61, the archive no longer felt locked away from life. It remained controlled, quiet, and protected, but selected records could be studied by appointment. Nathan had stabilized several fragile letters and trained Evelyn and Claire in the procedures needed to handle the collection safely. Richard no longer referred to the archive only as an expense. For her birthday, Claire brought a small cake upstairs. Richard brought coffee. Nathan arrived with a new archival storage box wrapped in a ribbon, which Evelyn called the most predictable gift he could possibly have chosen. They ate around the reading table where Evelyn had first opened Anna's letters. No large celebration, no speeches, just 4 people surrounded by nearly a century of preserved words. Claire looked toward Margaret's letters. Can I ask you something? That depends. Are you still angry with Grandma for making you wait until 60? Evelyn considered the question. A year earlier, she might have believed understanding was supposed to erase anger. The archive had taught her otherwise. Yes, she said. Claire looked surprised. Richard smiled faintly. Evelyn continued. Part of me probably always will be. She made a decision for me that affected 18 years of my life. She had reasons. Some were good reasons. That doesn't mean I have to pretend I liked what she did. But you understand her now. More than I did. Evelyn looked at Margaret's handwriting through the protective sleeve. Understanding someone isn't the same as declaring them right. Richard raised his coffee. Finally, a family principle I can support. Evelyn smiled. Mom wasn't perfect. Dad wasn't either. Anna and Ruth weren't symbols. They were people who made choices, lost choices, loved people, resented people, and sometimes got things wrong. She glanced at Claire. That's what preserving the letters changed for me. It didn't make them better. It made them human. After the others finished cake, Claire brought out the new archival box Nathan had given Evelyn. Together they prepared the first entries for what Claire jokingly called the part where everyone discovers Mom had terrible handwriting. Evelyn placed a copy of the letter she had written to Claire inside. Claire added a short note of her own about reading it. Evelyn considered the label. For nearly a century, the archive had moved through Anna, Ruth, and Margaret before reaching her. 3 generations had preserved enough of themselves that Evelyn could recognize patterns nobody had ever explained aloud. It would have been easy to label the new box Final Generation, as though she were completing something. Evelyn picked up the archival pencil and wrote instead, 4th Generation Beginning. Claire read it over her shoulder. Beginning, I don't know who reads this someday. That sounds suspiciously like a family tradition.
This one comes without an age restriction. Claire laughed. Evelyn placed the box on the shelf beside Margaret's materials. She finally understood that the family trust had never protected a fortune waiting to transform her life at 60. It had protected something easier to lose. Anna had feared her work would disappear from the history of a business she helped build. Ruth had feared that the choices denied to her would vanish until staying looked entirely voluntary. Margaret had feared that Evelyn would spend her life mistaking the family's failure to make room for her as proof she deserved no room. Thomas, imperfectly and silently, had protected their words until the decision became Evelyn's. But the trust had not preserved those letters merely because old paper deserved to survive. It preserved a chain of women who feared their lives would eventually be simplified by people who had not lived them. Evelyn had once believed Richard inherited the family while she inherited something locked away from it. At 61, working in a room beside the archive, she no longer measured belonging by who had received the building, the business responsibilities, or the larger visible inheritance. Richard had his place in the Mercer story. So did she. One evening after Claire and Nathan had left, Evelyn finished repairing a 19th century book in her workroom and walked next door to turn off the archive lights. Richard was downstairs locking the building. The new box sat among the older ones, ordinary and almost empty. Evelyn touched its label. Anna, Ruth, Margaret, Evelyn. 3 generations had left letters for a woman they could not fully know. The 4th had finally answered, not by obeying them, but by adding her own truth beside theirs. Evelyn switched off the lamp and left the archive door unlocked until she and Richard were ready to close the building for the night. For 18 years, she had thought the family trust existed to keep her out. She understood now that its purpose had been to keep the story intact long enough for her to enter it.